last lesson, we talked about repetition in musical form. Our final example from Schumann's Kinderszenen was of a rounded binary form. Recapitulation was used as a way to round off the form. Now I want to look at a more complex example, Chopin's Nocturne, Opus 55, number 1, in F minor. Here the main theme returns after two rather contrasting episodes. On the surface, it sounds like what is commonly referred to as a ternary form, ABA, but that greatly oversimplifies this beautiful piece. Let's look at it in more detail. The nocturne starts off with the main idea, 8 bars long. It's then repeated almost literally, except for the ornament at the end, which is more elaborate the second time round. So already here, Chopin has intensified the repeat. This is followed by another phrase with more eighth note movement and richer harmony, creating a bit more momentum. Then a phrase built on the same motive over a dominant pedal follows. When the pedal is resolved, the tonic harmony restarts the main idea. Note that this time the theme is ornamented in a rather operatic style, and the cadence is also more elaborate in its trills and grace notes. The contrasting phrase and the phrase over the dominant pedal then return, and this section of the piece closes with the final return of the 8-bar first presentation. The operatic ornamentation is even more elaborate now. So this first section of the piece focuses on one idea, elaborating it with ornamentation and harmonic exploration. Now, at the più mosso, there's a substantial contrast with the dramatic idea alternating two motives. This modulates a bit, first to C minor and then to G minor. Now comes another contrast, building up gradually to a strong climax over Neapolitan harmony, which is followed by a sort of cadenza over an augmented sixth chord. This cadenza arrives at some rather dramatic sequential harmony, ending on a dominant seventh. This in turn leads to the return of the main idea, but the return is greatly abbreviated. Just the first phrase reappears. Then, instead of continuing the first idea, Chopin embarks on an accelerating coda with faster triplets starting in a higher register. This cadence is over a long tonic pedal, simply repeating the same arpeggio motive rising into the high register. This fades out and the nocturne finally closes with a simple homophonic cadence. All the momentum is gone. Unlike, say, the ternary form we looked at in Lesson 13, this is much richer and more nuanced. This goes with the more serious character. Simple ternary forms are too obvious and symmetrical to express more complex and introspective emotions. The first section here relies on a lot of ornamented repetitions to emphasize its character. When the middle section arrives, the change of motive is abrupt and dramatic. The next contrast is also rather sudden and leads to the main climax of the piece. Unlike these abrupt contrasts, the transition back to the main idea is smoother. The final appearance of the main idea is much shorter, consisting of only one phrase, before the accelerating triplets arrive. Probably Chopin's decision to abbreviate the return here is because the first time included so much repetition. Doing it all again would have been too obvious and too symmetrical for the character of the piece. What I want to emphasize here is that repetition is not black and white. There are many degrees of repetition, just as there are many degrees of contrast. For a composer, getting the right amount of repetition is often not a simple matter. Too much repetition and the form gets too square and predictable. Not enough and it seems to wander off into the wilderness. Sensitivity to the desired musical character here is the main criterion. Also, notice how increasingly elaborate ornamentation gives the first section a sense of progression through its many repetitions of the main idea. When it comes back in the last section, one phrase suffices since it's already familiar to the listener. So the questions of how much repetition, out of literal repetition versus repetition with some kind of progression, are also not simple. A great composer like Chopin will work hard to get these things just right. Just as no two sonata forms are totally identical, no two of these ternary forms will be identical. And the right decisions make all the difference between a boring routine piece and something wonderful, where the composer plays with our expectations, gradually enriching our experience as we progress through the piece. Finally, note the variety in the transitions between sections. If all the transitions are equally abrupt, the form seems crude. Here, by making a more gradual transition into the last reprise, Chopin creates a richer emotional progression as the mood after the second section's climax leads smoothly back to the main idea. So repetition isn't as simple as it seems. In our next lesson, we'll look at repetition over much larger time spans.